It's 1960. America is wide open. The highways are fresh, the farms are expanding, the cities are growing faster than anyone can keep up with. And every working man in this country, every farmer, every contractor, every builder, every hauler, needs one thing above everything else. A truck that will not let him down. That was the promise. That was the challenge. And what General Motors built in response to that challenge would go on to become one of the most important vehicles in the history of the American automobile. This is the story of the 1960 to 1966 Chevrolet and GMC C/K trucks. This is the story of how America got its first true modern pickup. And this is the story of why, more than 60 years later, gearheads and collectors and working men still talk about these trucks with something that goes way beyond admiration. They talk about them with love. Before we talk about the truck that changed everything, we need to talk about the world it was born into. Because you cannot understand how revolutionary the C/K was unless you understand what came before it. In the late 1950s, General Motors was the most powerful automaker on the planet. Chevrolet was selling cars at a pace that seemed almost impossible. The designs were bold, the chrome was blinding, the tail fins were getting so big they were practically aerodynamic. America was in love with the automobile, and General Motors was at the center of that romance. But the trucks? The trucks were a different story. GM's workhorse pickup going into 1960 was the Task Force series. And listen, the Task Force was a fine truck. Tough, dependable, proven. It had served American working men faithfully through most of the 1950s, and it had earned every bit of its reputation. But the engineers at General Motors, the ones sitting at those drafting tables running the calculations, testing the prototypes, they knew something important. The Task Force was already old. Not old in the way that made it unreliable. Old in the way that meant it had been designed for a different era, a different America, a different kind of worker. The Task Force was essentially built on the same basic principles that had governed truck design since the 1930s. Solid front axle, straight frame rails, a cab that sat high off the ground. Simple, proven, traditional. And there was nothing wrong with tradition, unless you could see what was coming next. The American worker was changing in 1960. The farmer wasn't just a farmer anymore.
He was a businessman.
He had a family. He drove to town on weekends. He wanted a vehicle that could handle a load of hay on Monday and a church run on Sunday without feeling like he was piloting a military vehicle. He wanted capability without punishment. He wanted toughness without roughness. That gap between what trucks were and what trucks needed to become was exactly the space that General Motors decided to fill. Not with an update, not with a facelift, not with a few new options added to the order sheet. With an entirely new truck. Built from scratch. Built to be better in every possible way. And they named it the C/K. Now, here is something that most people overlook when they talk about the C/K. Before this truck came along, GM's pickups had model names that were practically meaningless to the average buyer. Numbers like 3100 and 3600 that told you something about payload ratings if you knew the code and told you absolutely nothing if you didn't. You were not going to walk into a dealership and feel inspired by a 3600. GMC changed all of that with a naming system that was elegant in its simplicity. C stood for conventional.
Two-wheel drive.
The standard working truck. K stood for four-wheel drive. The truck that could go anywhere. And alongside those letters came a number, 10, 20, or 30 for Chevrolet and 1000, 1500, 2500, 3000 for GMC. That told you the payload class. Light, medium, or heavy. Half-ton, three-quarter-ton, 1 ton. Simple.
Clear. Direct.
But more than the naming system, there was something even more significant about the K designation. For the very first time in General Motors history, four-wheel drive was a factory option. Not something you had to take your new truck to a specialty shop to have converted. Not a second-party modification that voided your warranty and made your mechanic nervous. A genuine, factory-engineered, factory-installed four-wheel drive system designed by the same team that designed everything else about the truck, built to work in harmony with everything else about the truck. You walked into a Chevrolet dealership. You ordered a K10. You drove off the lot in a factory four-wheel drive pickup truck, ready for anything. ready for everything. That had never happened before. And it changed the truck market permanently. Now, let's get into the engineering because this is where the story gets genuinely remarkable. Every pickup truck built in America before the C/K used what engineers called a straight frame. Two parallel steel rails running the full length of the truck, front to back. Like two railroad tracks. Strong, simple, time-tested. Every truck manufacturer in America used it because it worked and because nobody had seriously challenged whether it could be improved. The engineers at General Motors challenged it. They designed what became known as a drop center frame. Instead of running perfectly straight and level, the frame actually dropped lower in the middle section between the front and rear axles. And this change, this single design decision, cascaded into a series of improvements that transformed what a pickup truck could be. Because of that lower frame, the engineers could mount the cab 7 inches lower than it sat on the previous generation of trucks. 7 inches lower. That is not a small number when you are talking about a vehicle you climb into every morning of your working life. 7 inches is the difference between stepping up into a truck and walking into one. It is the difference between your wife complaining every time she gets in and your wife actually enjoying the ride. It is the difference between a truck that feels agricultural and a truck that feels modern. But the benefits went even further than comfort and convenience. A lower cab meant a lower center of gravity. A lower center of gravity meant better stability on tight corners, on dirt roads, on the kind of terrain that used to send older trucks into dangerous body roll. The truck was safer. The truck was more confident. The truck was simply better to drive. And the frame itself was not just different, it was stronger. The half-ton and three-quarter-ton trucks used a hybrid design that combined elements of the X-frame with elements of the perimeter frame. More complex to engineer, yes. But the result was a truck that could take the punishment of the upgraded suspension without flexing or fatiguing. 3 wheelbase lengths gave buyers exactly the right tool for their needs. The short-bed half-ton trucks rode on 115 inches of wheelbase, nimble, easy to maneuver in tight spaces, perfect for the farmer who needed to thread between buildings or park in a crowded lot. The longer 8-foot bed trucks stretched to 127 inches, giving hauling capacity without sacrificing too much agility. And the big 1-ton trucks with their enormous 9-foot beds ran on 133 inches of wheelbase, planted and stable under the heaviest loads. Every measurement had a reason. Every dimension served a purpose. This was engineering as craft. But if the frame was a revolution, the suspension was a revelation. In 1960, every other pickup truck in America, every single one, used a solid front axle. A beam of steel connecting the two front wheels. Simple, tough, proven. When the right front wheel hit a pothole, the left front wheel felt it. When the left front wheel dropped into a rut, the right front wheel tilted with it. The axle connected everything, and everything that happened to one wheel happened, in some measure, to the other. GM threw that away entirely. The C/K launched with independent front suspension. Each front wheel mounted on its own set of control arms, riding its own springs, absorbing its own bumps, moving completely independently of its opposite. You could drive the right front wheel over a rock, and the left front wheel would have no idea anything had happened. The early trucks used torsion bar springs to achieve this. Long, twisted steel bars that provided spring force as they wound up under load. It was an elegant solution, though packaging the torsion bars in the tight confines of the new drop center frame required some creative engineering. By 1963, the engineers went back and refined it further. The torsion bars were replaced by coil springs, which were more compact, more durable, and ultimately more effective. The front suspension became even better, even more sophisticated. For the rear axle, buyers had genuine options that matched their real-world needs. The standard rear setup was a coil-sprung axle with trailing control arms. Smooth, controlled, comfortable under normal loads. For the guys doing serious hauling, leaf springs were available and were standard equipment on 1-ton trucks from the beginning. And for the buyers who needed the best of both worlds, GM offered an option that combined coil springs with auxiliary leaf springs, comfortable empty, capable loaded. This level of engineering sophistication in a pickup truck was unheard of in 1960. Ford was not offering this. Dodge was not offering this. International was not offering this. Nobody was offering this. General Motors had built the most advanced light truck on the market, and they had done it by refusing to accept that trucks could not ride like cars. Now, let's talk about the engines, because this is the part that makes your pulse quicken a little if you have any love at all for the golden age of American power plants. When the C/K launched in 1960, Chevrolet offered two engine choices and GMC offered its own power plant, and each one represented a different philosophy about what a truck engine needed to be. The base Chevrolet engine was the 235.5 cubic inch inline-six. The Stovebo, they called it, and that name carried decades of working-class credibility. It made 135 horsepower, which sounds modest today but was entirely appropriate for a working truck in 1960. What the Stovebo lacked in excitement, it more than compensated for in reliability. These engines ran and ran and ran. They did not complain. They did not fail. They simply worked, day after day, year after year. The GMC version of the C/K came standard with something considerably more dramatic. A 305 cubic inch V6 making 150 horsepower. A V6 in a truck in 1960, when most passenger cars were running inline sixes, and the V8 was still considered an exciting upgrade. The GMC power plant was loud, characterful, and powerful, and it suited the GMC reputation perfectly, a truck for serious professionals who wanted serious performance. And then there was the optional engine, the one that changed everything for anyone who ticked that box on the order form. The 283 cubic inch V8. The small block Chevrolet. The engine that was already a legend in the sports car world, now available in a pickup truck. Making 160 horsepower in truck tune, with the kind of torque delivery that made hard work feel almost effortless. The small block in the engine bay of a C/K was a combination that felt entirely right because both the engine and the truck had been designed with the same fundamental values: simplicity, durability, and more performance than anyone had any right to expect. In 1963, the engine lineup grew more sophisticated. Two brand-new inline-six engines replaced the old Stovebo on the Chevrolet side. The 230 cubic inch turbothrift became the new base 6, making 140 horsepower with improved efficiency over the engine it replaced. But the one that really mattered, the one that would become a legend in its own right, was the optional 292 cubic inch inline-six. The 292 was a big engine by any measure. Long stroke, torquey, built for heavy-duty use from its very first day of production. It made 165 horsepower at just 3,800 revolutions per minute, which meant it was pulling hard before most V8s had even cleared their throats. The GMC V6 had finally met its match in a Chevrolet engine. And the 292 worked so well, was so fundamentally right for truck duty, that it remained in production all the way through the mid-1980s. More than 2 decades of continuous production. That is the definition of a great engine. The 283 V8 was retuned to 175 horsepower in 1963 as well, keeping pace with the improved 6-cylinder competition. But 1965 was when the engine story hit its absolute peak. Chevrolet made the 327 cubic inch V8 available as an option in the C/K pickup. The 327 4-barrel carburetor, 220 horsepower at 4,400 revolutions per minute. 320 pound-feet of torque at 2,800 revolutions per minute. This was the engine that made Corvettes fast. This was the engine that drag racers built their entire race programs around. This was one of the most celebrated, most beloved, most iconic American V8 engines of the entire post-war era. And you could have it in a pickup truck. Initially, Chevrolet restricted the 327 option to the heavier 3/4-ton and 1-ton trucks, on the theory that those buyers were more likely to need the extra power for hauling. But for the final model year, 1966, the 327 became available across the entire C/K pickup lineup. Every truck, every configuration. You could order a half-ton short bed with a 327 V8 and a 4-barrel carburetor, and nobody at the dealership would raise an eyebrow. That same year, the 236 was retired and replaced by the 250 cubic inch inline-six, making 155 horsepower. Alongside the 292, The 250 would continue powering C/K trucks well into the next decade. Both engines were honest, capable, and built for the long haul. These were not merely good engines for their era. These were the engines that defined an era. The engines that powered the construction of suburbs and the harvesting of fields and the building of a modern America. When historians look back at the tools that built this country in the 1960s, these engines deserve a place in that story. Now, the mechanical story is extraordinary, but a truck also has to look the part. It has to have presence. It has to stand in a parking lot or a field and make you feel something before you even open the door. And the first-generation C/K absolutely delivered on that front. The cab was all new from the roof to the floor. Wider than what had come before. Lower, thanks to that revolutionary frame. More glass area, which meant better visibility in every direction. The dashboard was modern and functional, laid out in a way that made sense to a working man without making him feel like he was operating a spaceship. Two bed styles told the story of the two different Americas that bought these trucks. The step side, called the fender side by GMC, was tradition in steel. The exposed rear fenders wrapped around the outside of the bed, the narrow cargo floor between them carrying decades of working-class heritage. Stepside buyers were not choosing the most practical option. They were choosing character. They were choosing a certain rugged, timeless look that connected them to every truck that had come before. And there was nothing wrong with that. There is a reason stepside pickups remain some of the most sought-after collector trucks on the market today. The fleet side, called the wide side by GMC, was the modern choice. Smooth slab sides flush with the cab. A wide, flat cargo floor that gave you maximum usable space without the intrusion of wheel well housings. Clean, efficient, contemporary. The fleet side was the future of pickup design, and the market recognized it almost immediately. Both could be had with 6.5-foot or 8-foot beds. Only the step side offered the 9-foot bed, because the fleet side's design simply did not accommodate the length without compromising the wheel well arrangement. Through the years, the look continued to evolve. In 1962, the hood was restyled, cleaning up the design and giving the front end a more modern face. In 1963, the grille underwent additional refinement. And then in 1964 came the most significant body update of the entire generation. The windshield was redesigned. The A-pillar, that structural corner post that had always intruded into the driver's space and blocked sightlines, was reworked to eliminate what engineers called the dogleg. New door stampings came with the new A-pillar. A new dashboard followed. New door panels. The 1964 and later trucks had an interior that genuinely impressed, that made the driver feel valued rather than merely accommodated. And starting in 1965, for the first time in the history of GM pickup trucks, you could order factory air conditioning. Factory air conditioning. In a pickup truck. In 1965. That might seem like a small thing in retrospect, but it was a statement about what the pickup truck was becoming. It was no longer merely a tool to be endured. It was a vehicle to be enjoyed. The American pickup was evolving from an appliance into something closer to an all-purpose vehicle, and the first-generation C/K was right there at the front of that evolution. The trim-level story is worth telling because it reveals something interesting about how the two GM divisions thought about their customers. Chevrolet kept it simple. One trim level, with optional custom upgrades for buyers who wanted a bit more refinement. This was consistent with Chevrolet's positioning as the people's truck, accessible, democratic, a working vehicle for working people. You ordered what you needed, you skipped what you didn't, and you drove it until it wore out. GMC took a different approach. Two trim levels from the very beginning, a standard deluxe specification and an upgraded custom cab for buyers who expected more. GMC positioned itself as the professional's choice, the fleet operator's choice, the choice of buyers who made their living with their truck and considered it a tool that reflected the quality of their work. A GMC in custom cab trim was a serious piece of equipment for serious professionals. Both approaches were right for their respective audiences. Chevrolet reached the farmer, the weekend hauler, the family man who needed a truck. GMC reached the contractor, the fleet manager, the commercial operator. Together, they covered the entire spectrum of the American truck-buying public. And in those first 2 years, 1960 and 1961, Chevrolet gave its trucks something that no accountant ever would have suggested, but every enthusiast will forever be grateful for. Names. The light-duty trucks, the 10, 20, and 30 series, were called the Apache. The medium-duty 50 and 60 series carried the Viking nameplate. And the heaviest trucks, the 70 and 80 series, wore the name Spartan.
Apache.
Viking.
Spartan.
Not numbers. Not codes. Warriors. Legends. Names that meant something, that carried weight, that told you exactly what kind of machine you were dealing with. Chevrolet was not selling you a vehicle. They were selling you an identity, a heritage, a connection to something ancient and powerful. This truck is as tough as the toughest warriors in history. It does not surrender. It does not quit. That was not just marketing language. That was a covenant between the manufacturer and the buyer. And General Motors honored it. The C/K was never just a pickup truck. It was a platform, a foundation upon which General Motors built an entire ecosystem of vehicles. The most important of those was the Chevrolet Suburban. The fifth generation of the Suburban, built on the C/K chassis, was the best Suburban that had ever existed to that point. It shared the independent front suspension, the drop-center frame, the modern powertrain, and the comfortable cab with its pickup truck sibling. And it competed directly, honestly, successfully, against the International Travelall and the original Jeep Wagoneer for buyers who needed to carry people and cargo in equal measure. The Suburban was available in four-wheel drive. It was available in half-ton and three-quarter-ton configurations. It was available as a full-size truck-based wagon in an era when nobody had invented the phrase sport utility vehicle yet. But that is exactly what it was. An SUV, before the name existed, built on the most capable light truck platform America had ever produced. And then there is the story that almost nobody tells when they talk about the C/K. The story that takes the legacy of these trucks and stretches it across an ocean to somewhere you would never expect.
Brazil.
From 1964 to 1988, a full 24 years, General Motors Brazil produced a vehicle called the Chevrolet Varanio. It was a five-door truck-based wagon, derived from the C14 pickup, itself a variation built on C/K architecture. And the Varanio did something that the American Suburban would not do for another decade. It offered 5 doors. 2 generations before the American Suburban added a 5th door in 1973. A Brazilian utility vehicle, built on the bones of an American pickup truck from 1960, pioneered the layout that would eventually define the modern large SUV. That is not a footnote in the C/K story. That is the C/K story reaching forward across decades and across continents to touch a future that its designers never could have imagined. Most conversations about the first-generation C/K stay in the comfortable territory of the half-ton and three-quarter-ton pickups. The C10 and C20, the K10 and K20, the trucks you see restored and gleaming at car shows every summer weekend across America. But the full story goes much bigger than that. The same cab, the same modern dashboard, the same independent front suspension. These things sat on trucks that went far beyond any light-duty application. The medium-duty C50 and C60 and their GMC equivalents in the 3500, 4000, and 5000 series wore the same face as the pickup but carried loads that would stop a modern half-ton in its tracks. These were commercial trucks, fleet trucks, the machines that built roads and delivered materials and kept the infrastructure of a growing nation moving. The C60H variant pushed its gross vehicle weight rating to 22,000 pounds, more than 10 tons of truck, with the same cab your neighbor drove to the feed store on Saturday morning. Above those came the heavy-duty models, the C70, the C80. Conventional semi-tractors wearing the same DNA as the C/K light-duty family. Then the tandem rear-axle M-Series trucks with twin rear wheels on each side, hauling loads that required a different kind of driver, a different kind of road, and a different kind of respect. These trucks did not appear at car shows. They did not get restored and trailered to concours events. They worked until they were worked out, and then they were replaced by the next generation of trucks that owed everything to the foundation laid by the C/K. They are the forgotten members of the family, but they deserve to be remembered, because they were there, hauling the steel, pouring the concrete, delivering the goods, keeping America moving while nobody watched and nobody photographed them and nobody wrote magazine articles about them. They were working. And working was enough. 6 years. That is how long the first-generation C/K trucks were produced. 1960 through 1966. 6 model years. And in those 6 years, they went from being a radical departure to being the established standard. From a revolutionary new design that nobody was sure the market would accept, to a beloved institution that buyers were already loyal to before its replacement arrived. When GM introduced the second-generation C/K for the 1967 model year, the Action Line series, they were not starting over. They were building on a foundation that 6 years of production and millions of working miles had proven to be absolutely sound. That is the measure of truly great engineering. It does not just solve the problem in front of it. It creates a template that everything that follows can build upon without apology. And the first-generation C/K created exactly that kind of template. The independent front suspension that seemed radical in 1960 would remain a C/K feature for decades. The drop-center frame philosophy would influence truck design for generations. The small-block V8 engines that powered these trucks would go on to become the most produced, most modified, most celebrated American V8 family in history. The suburban platform that grew from the C/K would evolve into the dominant American full-size SUV of the late 20th century. All of it grew from 6 years of trucks.
6 years of getting it right.
When you see a first-generation C/K at a car show today, and you will see them because these trucks survive, because they were built by people who understood that survival was the point, take a moment to really look at it. Look at how that cab sits relative to the ground. Notice how much lower it is than the trucks that came before it. 7 inches lower. Almost a foot lower. It changed the truck's entire visual character, gave it a planted, purposeful stance that still looks right 60 years later. Look at the proportions. The relationship between the cab and the bed, the way the body lines flow, the face that manages to be both functional and handsome without trying too hard. These trucks were not designed to be beautiful. They were designed to be capable. But capability, done right, is its own kind of beauty. Look at the front suspension, if you can see it. Those control arms and coil springs that replace the solid beam axle. That is the engineering decision that separated this truck from everything that came before it. That is the decision that made the C/K modern in a way that its competitors would spend years trying to match. Think about the man who ordered this truck new. Maybe it was a rancher in Colorado who needed something that could handle mountain roads in winter. Maybe it was a contractor in Ohio who needed a truck capable of pulling a trailer loaded with equipment 5 days a week. Maybe it was a family man in Georgia who wanted a truck for work but needed his wife to be willing to get in it without complaint. Whatever he needed, General Motors built him something that exceeded every expectation. A truck that was tougher than anything that had come before. More comfortable than any truck had a right to be. More capable in four-wheel drive than buyers had ever experienced from a factory vehicle. More powerful in its engine options than anyone had thought to put in a pickup truck. More refined in its interior than the working truck segment had ever seen. They gave him more than he asked for. And they did it 6 years in a row. Here is why these trucks still matter. Here is why, in an era of electric vehicles and digital dashboards and trucks with more computing power than the Apollo missions, people still seek out first-generation C/K trucks and restore them and drive them and love them. It is because these trucks represent a clarity of purpose that is genuinely rare. Every decision made in the design of the first-generation C/K was made in service of one goal: building the best truck that human engineering could produce in 1960. Not the most profitable truck. Not the easiest truck to manufacture. Not the truck that would look the most impressive in a brochure. The best truck. And the people who made those decisions were willing to do the difficult thing, the expensive thing, the unconventional thing, if the difficult and expensive and unconventional thing produced a better truck. They ditched the straight frame when a drop center frame was better. They replaced the solid front axle when independent suspension was better. They offered the 327 V8 when buyers wanted more power. They built the 5-passenger Suburban when Americans needed more cargo capacity than a pickup could provide. They listened to what the world needed. And they delivered it without compromise. That kind of conviction produces machines that outlast the era that created them. That kind of engineering produces trucks that are still running 60 years later, still admired, still driven, still loved. A machine built without compromise lasts because it was never designed to fail. It was designed to work. The 1960 to 1966 Chevrolet and GMC C/K trucks. Born when America was young and ambitious and building itself as fast as its hands could move. Designed by engineers who believed that a pickup truck could be sophisticated without losing its soul. Powered by engines that became legends in their own right. Built on a platform so fundamentally correct that it shaped everything that followed for the next 30 years. These trucks hauled the lumber and pulled the trailers and worked the fields and built the suburbs and carried the families and outlasted everything that was supposed to replace them. They're still out there. In garages and barns and car shows and on back roads on Sunday mornings. Running strong, looking right, sounding exactly the way an American truck is supposed to sound. The C stood for conventional. But there was nothing conventional about them. There never was. This has been the story of the 1960 to 1966 Chevrolet and GMC C/K, America's first true modern pickup truck, and one of the greatest machines ever built on American soil. Thank you for listening. And if you have got one of these trucks in your life, take care of it.
Drive it.
Let people hear it. Let people see it. It deserves to be seen.